Okay, thanks, Roger. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's Zoom session. This is now number 8. When I initially came up with the idea, I didn't think we would have such a comprehensive list of sessions and like the sort of like regular following that we have would be as good as this. So thank you all for the support. I'm glad that you're enjoying them. We've got quite a fairly extensive plan for the next couple of months. My intention is that we'll run them for every 2 weeks during the winter months, and then hopefully we will be back to normal come March next year, and we'll then revert to just doing them once a month when we're actually going out and we're free to move more than we are currently. So that's the plan. But anyway, tonight is a session that, thanks to Dad, who made the initial contact with Dougal, we're going to hear about his father's expedition as one of the first, well, the first person to sort of fly over Mount Everest in 1933 in a Westland Wallace. But over to Dougal.
Well, good evening to you all. It's a privilege to have been asked to speak to you tonight. And I've got to thank Graham and his father, Alec, whom I've known for many years as a modeler, giving me this opportunity. I've not been much of a scale modeler myself, I'm afraid, but I did make an attempt. This was the first one with a APS plan of the Prestwick Pioneer, which was designed by Bob Burns. And then with the foolhardy enthusiasm of youth, I designed and built a twin Pioneer in 1955 with a couple of Elfin 249s and a single channel radio. This was followed by a completer pack kit, which I fitted out as a Scottish Aviation EFTS number 12 Squadron Tiger Moth. And then lastly, a Sterling kit Spitfire, which was done up in the 602 Squadron Mark I colours. And then just to do something which tags on to the next, this was a solid scale model of the Wallace, which was commissioned by my mother from Danny Mitchell in the model shop in Prestwick in 1953 as an anniversary present to my father. So let's get started. The talk outlines the story of the 1933 Houston Mount Everest expedition from the perspective of my father, David McIntyre, who was the pilot of the second aircraft. I'll start with a short account of his flying background and then give you an insight into the Everest flight preparations. I'll illustrate the flight details and, if time permits, show how the Everest flight led on to my father's subsequent career. Father, newly qualified in March 1927, became the 4th pilot officer to join the City of Glasgow 602 Auxiliary Air Force Bomber Squadron. It was the first of the part-time squadrons to be set up. And in the May of 1927, the next pilot to join 602 Squadron was the Marquis of Douglas and Clydesdale. And he had learnt to fly his own Gypsy Moth aircraft at the de Havilland factory at Hatfield. And so in July of 1927, here they all are, the squadron's annual camp at Lucas. My father in the center at the back and Clydesdale to his left. The squadron was very competitive, with annual trophies awarded for the most efficient flight in the squadron. And this enthusiasm to be best was the trait that was to serve them well in the following years. During this time, Father and Clydesdale became close friends, and between them, they built up the efficiency of the squadron to such an extent that 602 won the Inter-Squadron Shield as the best of the 21 British auxiliary squadrons. At that time, they were flying these rather cumbersome, fairy-fawned biplanes. By 1930, he had reached the rank of flight lieutenant, and in 1931, he commenced a year-long full-time secondment to one of the RAF's premier squadrons known as the Shiny 12th. And here at Andover, he was in charge of their sea flight. He trained pilots on the latest Hawker Hart day bombers and became proficient in bombing practices. Another training challenge was formation flying in cloud, which must have been quite dodgy with only hand signal communication at the time. He finished his year in 12 Squadron with the highest rating of exceptional endorsed in his logbook. On his return to 602 in Renfrew, he was immediately involved in the preparations for the first flight over Mount Everest. In the light of rumblings that the French and Germans were actively planning flights over Everest, a British Everest Flight Committee was formed. It included the author and MP Colonel John Buchan, who had recommended Clydesdale, his fellow MP and aviator, as lead pilot. The flight was to take place in an era when aviation firsts were at their most prominent. Lindbergh had recently crossed the Atlantic, Byrd had reached both poles, and all manner of experimental flights were being done, but still, no one had flown over the highest point in Earth. I'll introduce you to the main features of the topography here. We have Everest on the left, Lhotse is about a mile away from it, and Makalu 12 miles to the east. I've also added this duplicate, if you like, of the previous slide because it features the underlined peak here called Peak 38, which I'll talk about in a minute. Clydesdale's first task was to persuade Lady Houston, who had financed the British win in the 1931 Schneider Trophy race, to finance the Everest venture. This he managed to do, and he then encouraged his fellow 602 flight leader, David McIntyre, to apply for the position of second pilot. The committee having decided that 2 aircraft would be needed to record events and support each other over this challenging terrain. Although father was in competition with many of the RAF's best pilots, he was selected. 2 Westland Wallace biplanes, fitted with specially modified and supercharged Bristol Pegasus engines, were prepared to give the 580 horsepower needed to maintain sustained flight at 34,000 feet. Much work had to be done to provide the oxygen and heating systems and to lighten the aircraft weight to reach this ceiling. Each aircraft carried a pilot and an observer to take the photographs. It was primarily a mission to conduct a photographic mapping survey of the hitherto unknown southern flanks of Everest. Clydesdale's aircraft, the Houston Westland, was a prototype Wallace designed for torpedo bombing with a wide undercarriage, and is seen here undergoing further modifications for the Everest flight. Originally a Wapiti 5, the prototype Westland Wallace, the second aircraft modified for the Everest flight, is getting its only test flight at Yeovil prior to being crated up and shipped to Karachi. It was taken up by Harold Penrose, Westland's chief test pilot, to 37,000 feet, when the new fuel pump failed and caused him to execute the longest engine-off descent anyone had yet made, landing at the nearest available airfield at Hamble. It so happens that they refitted the original pump and it gave no further trouble. The first flight of Clydesdale's modified machine took place in January 1933. On the right, Blacker, the chief observer, is being assisted by Clydesdale. And my father and Air Commodore Fellows, who was the expedition leader, are over the other side. The test flight went well, and the modified machine reached 34,000 feet and achieved all the performance targets. I always think this cockpit layout of the Wallace looks most rudimentary by today's standards. It was fitted out with extra controls to manage engine boost and heating and oxygen connections. These added considerably to the pilot's workload when flying these machines. The pilot also had to control the survey camera automatic exposure interval using a thing they called an intervalometer. This could be varied from 60 to 6 seconds as the ground got closer approaching Everest. He was alerted by a light to tell him that the next frame had been wound on, and another light to advise that the next exposure was to happen in 3 seconds, so that he could keep the wings level to avoid tilt distortion. The observer's cabin had a control panel for heating and oxygen management. The vertical survey camera with a heated jacket was mounted on the floor. The observer was provided with a drift sight from which he rotated the camera in a horizontal plane to adjust for the crosswind drift of the aircraft. He had to control the rheostat for the voltage being delivered to the heating systems of the crew and the cameras. And a 1,000-watt engine-driven dynamo was mounted on the bulkhead behind the engine to drive the 14-volt system. But it varied with engine speed, and so had to be kept within a range of 13 to 15 volts. The rear fuselage, wings and tail surfaces were canvas covered. The canvas side of the Wallace was able to be unzipped to reveal the basic structure of the airframe. The aircraft was stripped of all non-essential weight to obtain height performance needed. And the metal stringers and fabric covering the Wallace are clearly seen in this view, where the equipment in the observer's cabin is being checked. Oxygen bottles for the observer were stored in racks at the rear fuselage, and oxygen for the pilot under his seat. The simple wire-braced tubular framework of the aircraft is evident, and they also had to compensate for the changes of length as temperature got colder. The survey camera seen here mounted in the base of the observer's cabin had an automatic exposure capability, with the exposure interval being able to be adjusted by a flexible drive cable attached to a control box located in the cockpit. It was necessary to obtain overlapping images to get a decent 3D result, and this was determined by the height above the ground. As the terrain was mountainous, the area covered by each frame varied with height and required exposure intervals to vary with height. The profile of the terrain was drawn and sectioned into 5 separate height zones, for which an average height above the ground was determined. As the overlap distance could also be determined, would also be determined by ground speed of the aircraft, Father devised a rotary calculator to show the time intervals required for a selected range of speeds. It proved, however, to be ineffective, as the pilot was unable to judge his ground speed in the strengthening winds. The team flew out to India in a fleet of 3 de Havilland Moth aircraft, also used to provide logistics support out there. One was Clydesdale's own Gypsy Moth, and the other 2 aircraft were a Puss Moth flown by Fellows and a Fox Moth piloted by Clydesdale. The send-off gathering on a cold February morning at Heston Aerodrome showed Father, Fellows and Clydesdale, flanked by Hughes, who was Clydesdale's personal mechanic, and Shepherd, who was the reporter from the Times who handled the publicity. This map shows their outward journey in red and the return journey in blue. Their insurance company insisted that they must use the more clement Mediterranean route in the winter. My father led the group on this journey in Clydesdale's Gypsy Moth, being the slowest, which had been streamlined to give a cruising airspeed of 95 miles an hour. And it was the only one equipped with a turn and bank indicator to enable safe flying in cloud. My father was in charge of all the navigation, which proved challenging when flying over featureless desert, guided by map and compass only. He was reputed to have flown low over native camel riders to see how their robes blew in the wind to calculate the crosswind component for their navigation. They were delayed by storms for 3 days in Sicily and stopped for routine engine maintenance at Cairo before reaching here at Baghdad 16 days after departure. There were many tricky moments during this journey, especially when dust storms blew up in the desert, and Father recounted having to fly at 100 feet following a pipeline to keep on track. Customs were a continual problem, and they were arrested in Sicily for allegedly flying over prohibited territory, but quickly released. Here at Gwadar, along the Persian Gulf, they had to sleep under the stars, as there were no facilities at the airfield other than an insect-infested hut, which they declined to use. Father records that he actually slept underneath the wing of the aircraft. On the 7th of March, they reached Karachi, completing an 18-day journey that had been an adventure in its own right. And Clydesdale, in his notes, expressed the opinion that the wisdom of his choice of second pilot had now been recognized by all the team due to the foresight and ingenuity that my father had shown during the journey thus far. The crated Westland aircraft arrived safely after their 18-day sea crossing to Karachi and were unloaded from the ship to the railway wagons for the trip to the RAF depot just outside Karachi for reassembly. While the Everest machines were being rebuilt at Karachi, the team reconnoitered the route across India that they would have to take to reach their base camp at Purnia. They flew the Foxmoth and Gypsy Moth the 1,500 miles via Jodhpur, Delhi, and Allahabad to inspect the facilities at the Army landing ground Lal Balu. This was located 10 miles outside Purnia. They flew the Foxmoth and the Gypsy Moth. At Lal Balu, they inspected the work being done to prepare the airfield and construct the canvas hangars and the quarters for the engineers. And I remember reading that they cleared some trees on the boundary of the field to improve the approach. While at Purnia, Fowler and Clydesdale flew the Gypsy Moth 55 miles north to inspect the place where an emergency landing field had been laid out nearer to Everest. This proved okay, and they returned to the hangar of the Gypsy Moth at their Purnia headquarters. I have mentioned, but the Everest peak was 160 miles north of Purnia, so their landing ground was not really very close to the mountain at all. After completing their inspection, Father, Clydesdale, and Blacker returned to Karachi in the Foxmoth. However, during their overnight stop at Allahabad, there was a violent storm that wrecked the Foxmoth. It had been well secured against such an event, but clearly not enough. And they were left with a difficult 1,000-mile journey back to Karachi via Delhi by train and plane. My father's tale of this trip is amusing, but too long to relate just now. The local RAF mechanics rebuilt the Everest machines under the supervision of the expert engineers from Bristol's and Westlands who had accompanied the expedition. In this shot, the Wallace is being fueled up for its first engine test after reassembly. And here the Wallace is being wheeled out of the hangar for testing without its town end cowling ring. You can see my father and Clydesdale here leaning against the wing of the Wallace while it takes two mechanics to crank the starting handle. It's noticeable that the two pilots are wearing parachutes for these initial test flights, but they were not worn on the Everest flight to save weight. Each of the Everest machines had to be flight tested to 34,000 feet to check oxygen, camera, and heating equipment before leaving Karachi. And my father had not flown this specially modified Wallace before it left Britain, so he had also to familiarize himself with all the new equipment on board. His 2.5-hour flight did not reveal any problems in the minus 45-degree temperatures that they recorded. And you'll see the ground crew here are guiding the wingtips. This was because the aircraft had no brakes or steerable tailwheel to save weight. Clydesdale is checking out his Houston Westland prior to his first test flight in Karachi. I've got out of sequence here a wee bit. The pilots prepared detailed checklists to cover all eventualities. Their motto was, do all the thinking you need on the ground, not in the air. Getting to know the aircraft was an important task for the pilots, amongst other reasons being the special 13% larger diameter wooden propellers needed for their high altitude performance that only gave them 9 inches ground clearance on takeoff and landing. and I don't think they carried any spares. The pilots and observers also had to get used to the cumbersome heated flying suits and oxygen equipment. The handling of the camera equipment was another of the essential tests on these flights. And here Clydesdale is about to take the aircraft with his observer Blacker to 34,000 feet. Once the testing was complete, they had to fly the two Everest aircraft across the 1,500 miles of Indian countryside to reach their base camp at Purnia. This 3-day journey required the special fuel needed for each aircraft to be ferried out to each refueling stop in advance. Their first refueling stop was at Hyderabad before flying on to Jodhpur on their first night's stay. As you can see the fuel drums that they used in this photo, the tube coming up here. Where are we? Here we are. En route, they stopped at Delhi to meet the Viceroy, who had been instrumental in obtaining the permission from the Nepalese for a maximum of 2 flights over Everest. Flying over the Indian plains the next day, they were constantly on the lookout for vultures flying in the numerous thermals, as any contact would have been fatal. More than one near miss was reported before they reached Purnia. Meanwhile, the RAF engineers and other support team members travelled to Purnia by train. At the airstrip at Lal Balu, as well as canvas hangars for the Everest aircraft, tented quarters for the engineers were established at the airfield. When they arrived, the British Gaumont film crew was already at work on the Lal Balu field. The pilots found their presence something of a nuisance and were critical of the results produced, but recognized its necessity for the financing of the project. The eventual film won an Academy Award for the Best Documentary in 1936. I've got a couple of clips from it to show you in a minute. The local Maharaja generously loaned one of his bungalows in Purnia for the team's accommodation. And my father, in a letter home to his parents, recalls that the bungalow was just across the golf course from the Planters Club that supported the local indigo farming community and was where they spent most evenings. He also mentions climbing the local trees to collect fruit. And I often wonder what other mischief they got up to that we didn't hear about. The same local Maharaja who provided the bungalow also loaned 3 cars and a lorry to the team for the 9-mile journey to the airfield. The engineers whose tents had initially been pitched next to the bungalow soon relocated to the airfield to avoid the dusty journey back and forth. Right beside the airfield, my father spotted a pond overgrown with reeds. And under the direction of the district engineer and with the help from the local fishermen, they got the pond cleared and set about building themselves a diving platform. It became much used to cool off after a hot day's work on the airfield. However, almost as soon as the new pool was completed, bathing had to cease to allow them to shoot an opportunist 7-foot crocodile that had decided overnight to make the pool its own. Thereafter, they enlisted the help of the local fishermen as lookouts when they bathed. It's a native bathing costume, don't you think? The local tribes put on a welcome display and procession on the airfield to welcome the visitors. And this is a unique comparison of the old and new methods of transport and shows the advance in transport methods that are now evident. Most days, when the weather looked promising, the aircraft were made ready for a possible flight over the distant mountains. This was being done while they waited for the daily Met report and the reconnaissance flight to determine the cloud cover. The hangars were in need of constant repair due to damage from the passing storms, which occurred during the 2 weeks that they waited. Purnia supported its own Met station, which was managed by Gupta, the Met officer, who used a theodolite to track hydrogen balloons as they ascended to gauge the high-level wind speed and direction. He was the only casualty amongst the team during the expedition when a balloon caught fire and he suffered burns as a result. Here are fellows Clydesdale and Blacker, with the ever-present monocle, discuss the flight plans at the bungalow residence, while father sits just out of camera on the left with his ever-present cigarette. He's always seen with a cigarette. As a thank you to the Maharaja, the team offered to perform an aerobatic display in the Moth for the entertainment of his tea party guests, and this was received with great admiration and was a truly unique occasion for the district. Early each morning, fellows would fly off in the Puss Moth to a height of 17,000 feet to inspect the cloud conditions over Everest. His report would be combined with the data from Gupta's Met report to see if an attempt on the mountain was possible that day. For 2 weeks, they waited for the weather to become suitable. Invariably, the high westerly winds were always over 40 miles an hour, the limit they had set for themselves. But they were rarely below 100 miles an hour, which was a daunting prospect in a machine with a top speed of only 120 miles an hour at that altitude. But on the 3rd of April, 1933, with an estimated wind speed of 58 miles an hour at 30,000 feet, they decided to go. To get the aircraft out of the canvas hangars for their daily preparation took all of 20 minutes, as they were a tight fit. Here, the Houston Westland is being fueled with the special high lead content mixture prepared on site by the Burma Shell engineer who accompanied the flight. Now, this was hand pumped from the drums, and when filled to capacity, gave them 4 hours duration. The specially prepared 12.5-foot diameter fixed pitch wooden propeller was a precious component and was kept covered from the sun with a cover for as long as possible. Here, cameras are being loaded into the observer's cabin and everything checked. The moisture-free oxygen at 120 atmospheres in the cylinders was routed through a pressure gauge, then a regulating valve, and an electrical heater to prevent any moisture freezing in the system before being passed through a flow meter measuring altitude and through to the masks of the pilot and observer. Unseen, a third mechanic in the cockpit is engaging the hand-starting magneto switch, while these two do the heavy work of cranking the handle of the inertia starter on the Wallace. The handle was not carried on the Everest flight to save weight. It took the crews fully 20 minutes to get dressed and to connect up all the various bits of wiring and pipework which they found very hot and tedious, and the starting of the engines was timed to take account of this interval. A determined look here accentuates my father's face as he contemplates the flight ahead, donned up in the cumbersome suit that he described as abominable. The oxygen mask, cables, and pipework that restricted his movement are clearly seen. And I also notice in this picture, his camera, he's carrying his camera. So I don't think he actually took any photographs. He was too busy flying an airplane. Here, my father's using a rudimentary stepladder to get on board the Wallace, while Bonnet, his observers, waits his turn. And you'll notice the engine's already been started up by the ground crew prior to their arrival. And here, Clydesdale uses another rickety-looking ladder to clamber aboard the Houston Westland, while Blacker chats with fellows before his turn comes. The Houston Westland nearest the camera is ready for takeoff, while father and Bonnet finish clambering into the Wallace and loading their mail bag. Chocks away, Bonnet ducks down into his cabin as my father pulls away for the takeoff to Everest, waved off by fellows. I've included a clip from the Everest film which shows these preparations before the first flight. So here goes. he comes out.
Well, what's the wind velocity?
He's got this wrong.
It's dropped considerably.
Ah.
To the crossing. 57 miles at 33,000. Well, I think that's about the best we're likely to get. How's the visibility? 17,000 as a haze and no clouds. You prepared to go, Clydesdale?
I am indeed.
And you, McIntyre?
Rather, let's get on with it.
Well, come on, let's get our stress vessels down. Right, I'll go and get the engine machines out. Where's Bonnet? Come along, Bonnet. Where's Mr. Bus? Important, you should be with us. Bonnet, Mr. Pitt there.
Hello. Got his scarf
So
down.
we've decided to go, get the machines out, and stand by to start up the engines. Oh, turn from the engine, get the covers off. Oh! Mind your heater leads. Yes.
This bit of film was taken in Karachi, by the way.
Mind that ring on the left. Right, keep on moving.
This is them back at the Albaluna. The way they put bits of film together, the film really slightly well.
Warming up to it, isn't it?
Now, about this business of the heating and the oxygen, if anything goes wrong, it's absolutely your discretion, and there's no good being heroic. The only thing is for you to tell the pilot definitely to go back. Anything goes wrong with either of them.
Is that one full?
Quite okay, George. Put them in.
The underneath the pilot seat.
Right, Eric. Just coming.
Where's Everton?
Here we are.
Okay. The Wallace. I've always told the Wallace with a narrow undercarriage, and here's the Westland with the wide undercarriage. The small shot showed them using wetland at least, or not. So one of these bits of film is very better on the purposes of the film. There we are. Bit of film, okay. I thought you might be interested to see the standard of map that they were using to get to Everest at the time. You can see here, Father has penciled in his flight path at 342 degrees from Pernia to Everest. This is the last 40 miles from their control point down here, where they were going to start the survey cameras up to the peak of Everest here. Once they were in the air, there was no radio contact between the two aircraft, but they only had hand signals as they flew in formation. And the first checkpoint they made was an OK wave that was exchanged when they reached 10,000 feet, and knew they were both in good condition to continue. Rising to a height of 19,000 feet, a dust haze had obscured the ground, which made their control point landmark impossible to locate. They also find they were being carried further to the east of the mountain than planned because of higher than expected upper winds. And here again, above the dust haze, still climbing at about 28,000 feet, they're getting closer, where the connecting range between Everest and Makalu can now be easily seen. And here a little bit closer, this is Lhotse, and from the other side of the thing, Lhotse again. As they approached Lhotse, now blanketed in cloud, a mile south of Everest, they encountered a severe downdraft, and Father was forced down nearly 2,000 feet in a matter of minutes below the southern face of Lhotse. This put them in a perilous situation, and it required all their considerable skill to avoid a disaster. I spent a little bit of time trying to understand the detail of this. And in the book of Everest that was first published, this photograph was shown, titled "One of the Great Declivities of Everest." And when I first saw it early on, I always thought it was looking down on Everest. But it was only later I discovered there was a horizon to be seen over here. And so this photograph is not down on Everest, it's looking horizontally at what they thought was Everest. I then looked at the survey prints that were taken on the second flight over Everest, and from the details of these frames that were taken from the survey camera, I could identify exactly the same contours and snow cover from the vertical strip that you can see on this oblique photograph from the first flight. So that told me where that peak was. And that was a great step forward for me. I then found a National Geographic map where this particular peak was given a name, Peak 38. And so I examined it further by going into Google Earth. And in Google Earth, you can run a path, as they call it, and you can follow that path as a simulation. So that's us started at Makalu, heading towards Everest, which is up here top. And this is the Lhotse. And this is the dividing range which my father describes, having just managed to scrape over. And here is what turns out to be Peak 38. So if we take the other photo and put it aside here, I'm now absolutely convinced that I know exactly where that particular photograph was taken. So this is the track that I can understand, having from my father's account of the flight path that he took. In his book, he describes his problem thus: "We were in a serious position, the great bulk of Everest towering above us to the left, Makalu downwind to the right, and the connecting range dead ahead. There was nothing we could do but to climb straight ahead and hope to clear the lowest point in the barrier range. With the aircraft heading almost straight into wind, we crabbed sideways towards the ridge, unable to determine if we were level with it or below. A fortunate upcurrent just short of the ridge carried us up a few feet and we scraped over. We then started a grim fight for height. So you can see here, it came down all the time facing into wind, which is coming from the left here. They scrape over the barrier range just here, and they start wide, slow climbing circles to get up over the northeast ridge. I created, this was another photo I found more recently, which shows Makalu from the tailplane of the aircraft. And you realize when you look at the closeness of these rocks that it's right below them at the time they were going across the dividing range. I thought I'd try and simulate this part of the flight using Google Earth. You can see the tracks that I've used here. This is guesswork on my part. The green color here is the cloud, I think, that was coming off Lhotse at the time the Google Earth maps were imaged. So they heading towards Everest, getting near to Lhotse, and then the flight path turns around. Now, of course, the aircraft is still heading to the left here, although when you follow a Google Earth map, it assumes you're walking all the way along from forwards. They go over the dividing range, and they come up the back of Everest, what they call the Kangshung face of Everest. And I've just shown a zigzag, although in fact they were doing a circle. Backwards 3 times, getting a little bit higher. Now this simulation is at 30,000 feet. It's all at the same level, so I wasn't really able to show the climbing up effect of the path that they were taking. But they then finally go over the northeast ridge of Everest and round the top of Everest here, across back towards Lhotse, and then off back home again, wiping their brow, as it were. And this little yellow peg in the background is where the La Balou is, 160 miles to the south. Now, Clydesdale was in a slightly different position. He approached at a higher level to start with, and he didn't get the same height loss as Father had. He describes struggling over the top of Lhotse, much closer than he ever cared to remember, he says. And then he travels around Everest and circles it a couple of times. All the meanwhile, Father's scrambling about on the right down here, trying to get up. So the photographs they took, this is the Clydesdale's aircraft passing through the plume of Everest, which they discovered was made of ice crystals and not cloud. And it was sufficiently vigorous to crack the Houston Westland's windscreen. But he manages to get across the northeast ridge. And here's the tip of Clydesdale's aircraft looking down on the peak. But he was disappointed not to be able to see any sign of the climbers, Mallory and Irving, having been there during their climbing attempt in 1924. And the close-up of the photos of the peak of Everest proved a useful contribution to the 1953 climbing achievement of Hillary and Tenzing 20 years later. I've mocked up an impression of what the scene might have looked like from a climber on the top of Everest as they approached. but before hitting the downdraft. While father was crossing over Everest, he faced another alarming problem when he discovered that his cameraman Bonnet had passed out due to a fracture in his oxygen pipe, and so he had to return to base as soon as he safely could. His problems were then compounded when he found that his own oxygen mask had become detached when he turned round to see what was wrong with Bonnet, and this meant he had to hold his mask onto his face with one hand and fly the machine with the other. He described the next half hour as the worst he had ever faced as he descended to 8,000 feet, when he was mightily relieved to find Bonnet rising from the floor of the cabin, looking green, he said, but otherwise okay. I've shown a clip from the Everest film, which is the flying element of it. This is a composite clip.
Now the second phase of the flight began. For the first time, man was to look down upon the roof of the world, the majestic Himalayan range crowned by more than 70 peaks higher than any other peak on Earth. Across the unknown, Kanchenjunga towered up, a few feet only lower than Everest herself. Over a terrific land of cliffs, glaciers, and gorges. With the knowledge that should the engines or the oxygen fail, there was one slender hope, that the pilot might find beneath the clouds some snow-clad hill or riverbed where he might put down his machine and survive the certain wreck, days and weeks from human help or habitation.
I've often wondered if you look close enough at this, I might be able to see it. But I've never managed to do that. I don't know where he's gone. Or down here. That seemed to work all right. So here we have Fellows discussing the successful flight with his team on their return. And Bonnet shows us his broken oxygen pipe. The following day, Father flew the Pussmoth with the survey film to Calcutta for processing. However, the dust haze had obscured the visibility below 18,000 feet, and the film from both cameras proved unusable. So the survey objective of this mission had not been achieved. Although they'd achieved the flight over Everest, they hadn't actually got the main purpose of their mission completed. So because the cameras had misbehaved, it was decided to adjust and test them the following day during a flight to Ketchunjunga. This was chosen for its height, being only a little lower than Everest, at 28,146 feet, and being 90 miles to the east, free from Nepal's jurisdiction, and so it did not require permission. The two aircraft were flown by Fellows and Ellison, the reserve pilot. They got caught in thick cloud that had developed over the mountains and became separated. Fellows failed to return to base, having lost his way a bit, and short of fuel, had to force land about 60 miles from Purnia. Sensibly, he'd chosen to land next to a railway halt, where he was able to telegraph a message back to base and explain his situation. Clydesdale then flew the Moth out to assist Fellows and picketed the Houston Westland down for the night with a guard. There was no damage, and the Houston Westland was refueled and flown back to base the next day. However, the committee in London, on hearing of the incident, took fright and put an embargo on a second flight over Everest. One of the secondary objectives of the expedition was to evaluate the results of using infrared photography at high altitude. The Houston Westland, with its wide undercarriage, was able to have a camera strapped below the fuselage and be operated from the hatch in the floor of the observer's cabin. I think he had to stick his head out and put the frames in one at a time. A rudimentary system using a length of string attached between the pilot and the cameraman's wrists allowed the cameraman to communicate with the pilot to indicate that the next plate had been inserted in the camera and was ready for exposure. It seems to have worked okay, and as these results show, but they were disappointed that they'd not been able to get airborne before the afternoon clouds had enveloped Everest and the Makalu peaks. Being the chaps they were, Father and Clydesdale were determined not to squander all the training and knowledge gained on the first flight, and were keen to fully complete their mission. With just enough oxygen left, they conducted a second flight, which was uninsured, against the instructions of their committee in London, and while their leader was sick in bed with a fever. They managed to persuade him that the film crew needed more aerial footage and that they would stay within gliding distance of the landing field. Knowing how strong the westerly winds were likely to be at the summit, they planned this time to head further west at a low altitude before starting the climb to Everest. However, the day was not ideal, with a 15,000-foot cloud layer obscuring the mountains. And to avoid the risk of icing, Clydesdale took the opportunity of a gap in the cloud layer to begin their ascent rather earlier than they had intended. Once above the cloud layer, they were able to see that they were clear to the mountains and decided to make a second flight over Everest. Oxygen was switched on at 19,000 feet, and 20 miles from Everest at 31,000 feet, the survey cameras were switched on. Now this is Everest, and this is the names of the peaks that we'll get to know about. The strong drift to the east is evident when this photo provided the most famous of the Everest flight scenes. And these again are the mountains here. And here's Peak 38 that gave them identification in the first flight. However, just about the time that this photo was being taken, Clydesdale was experiencing a problem with his oxygen supply. He borrowed a screwdriver from his observer in order to fix it. But in the process, he had lost his heading in the strong crosswind. He decided to abandon his attempt to the summit and instead flew towards Makalu, off to the right, to continue the mapping survey. My father now found himself in a dilemma. RAF protocol required him to keep in formation with his leader, but the survey mission required him to head towards Everest. He decided to go for the summit, but found he was making very little headway, being in a much stronger wind than on the first flight. He continued for the next 15 minutes when he experienced a terrific bump, which he likened to being under an explosive factory when it blew up. Concluding this was the summit, he turned back to base, keeping his fingers crossed that he would find his way through the thick cloud layer on the correct heading. He landed after a flight of 3 hours 50 minutes, with only 10 minutes of fuel remaining. I've marked on this photo the rough track of the aircraft as they approached Everest on the second flight. And these are some of the peaks that we'll be looking at in a minute. It also shows the nature of the terrain that was photographed by the survey cameras. I shall run a 1-minute sequence of 59 of the 125 survey frames taken from our father's aircraft to show what's recorded on the day, followed by a Google Earth simulation following a similar path. So here's these are the actual frames that were taken at from father's aircraft. And every now and then you'll see a pencil line going through which he's written on them. And I've marked up the names of the various peaks I've been able to identify. And they found a hot lake up there, which isn't there now, if you have a look. This is the glacier below Lhotse. Island Peak, which is a well-known climber's, a mini peak. And Lhotse is covered in cloud when they're going over. And here you can see clearly he's rotating over the top of what I've identified as Lhotse 2. And this is Peak 38 here, which we saw from the first flight. And this is the barren glacier underneath. Now, I've always been curious. This is the Google Earth simulation of the same pathway, and you can see there's not much snow and ice around now. I don't know what year this was actually. It says 2013 on it, so maybe that was about the time Google Earth recorded these images. And Google Earth's mapping shows the names of some of these peaks as we go through, but not all of the ones I identified earlier. This is the quite difficult to identify these vertical pictures, I find. This is Numri. This is one of the peaks that we talked about. And Chopalu, this one here. So I pretty well managed to get the right track, I think. Peak 38 over here. Here's the cloud over Lhotse, Lhotse 2. Over the top of Lhotse 2. Back down again. There's the dividing range that they struggled over on the first flight. And another green bit, which is another bit of cloud. and then back onto the Barron Glacier down here. You notice I think if I'd done that just at this time of time, I think Google Earth have got a better set of images now, but at that time they're still a bit blocky. Now, I've always been curious, when you look at Father's photographs, he thinks he's flown over the top of Everest. And I asked myself, why? So I'd taken the same pathway at 34,000 feet in this occasion, and this is the pilot's view of the same pathway using the Google Earth simulation. I didn't get it started quite right. There's a bit of a delay at the beginning. There we go. So this is the same pathway that you saw from the vertical photos a minute ago. And all the time he's got this westerly wind, much stronger than he expected, having to correct for. So the whole time he's being blown one way and he's correcting to the left, trying to get to Everest against this. And he was doing this for 15 minutes. So he's still trying to get across to Everest here. And he's still drifting to the right. So he has to correct to the left again. And at this point, you can see we're actually, it looks as though we've gone over Lhotse. We're now heading for Everest. And now we think we've flown over the top of Everest. But in truth, he's over top of Lhotse, away behind him. Because of the angle that you're sitting at in the pilot's cockpit, you can't see out the side. So you think you're on top of Everest, but you're not. Here's Makalu on the way round. He does a little bit of a stint down here, and then he turns and heads back to base camp, 160 miles to the south. And this yellow peg up here is where he's aiming for, over the peak of Chanling. So that's what I think we can clearly see from the survey pictures that actually happened on the second flight. And this is the return photo taken from Clydesdale's machine around about the time Father was still struggling in the cloud up here in Lhotse. He arrived 15 minutes ahead of Father when they arrived back. And of course, when they got back, they had to fess up with fellows the fact that they'd actually done a flight over Everest, which they weren't supposed to. Father, you'll notice in this, he's got no heated helmet. He decided to wear an ordinary flying cap, and he flew it without goggles. But he had such a messy time with his fancy equipment on the first flight. The second flight, he just got rid of them all and went back to his ordinary flying suit and no goggles, which I think is quite amazing. Here is the printed map that was produced sometime later of the results of the survey. I've just taken the top end of it, what you might call the sort of business end of it. There's a lot of miles down to the below us, which I haven't shown. And I've shown the track of Father's aircraft in red here. And this is Lhotse 2, which he went over, but he didn't get to Everest. And this is the Kengshung Glacier and then the other Barron Glacier. And I've been able to identify these peaks, Island Peak, Thumri and Barentsi, which we've seen in the other pictures. So I'm now quite happy I understand what went on in this second flight. And it was quite an achievement. So that was them. They finished it and they had to pack up and go home. Clydesdale and Ellison flew the two Westland machines back to Karachi to be dismantled and shipped back home. Father, meanwhile, with Atherton in the Gypsy Moth, accompanied by fellows and his wife in the Pussmoth, did a sort of courtesy tour amongst a number of Indian princes and Maharajas on their way back to Karachi to explain what they had done. And in Udaipur, this place, this picture here, they witnessed a staged fight of a pig versus tiger. And they watched wild pigs coming out of the forest for their daily feed. And it was a town which Atherton described as though it had stepped out of a fairy tale, a little bit of Italy that had wandered off into the tropics and got lost. Quite un-Indian, in other words. After Udaipur, father flew back to Britain from Karachi in Clydesdale's Gypsy Moth with Ellison, accompanied by fellows and his wife in the Pussmoth, as chaperones maybe. Accompanied by fellows, this time the insurance company had permitted them to travel overland via Turkey and Europe. And this journey too chronicled many incidents. Hold on. At Istanbul, father's camera, as it had been in Italy, was confiscated and his film removed. And they had to flee Turkey rapidly the next morning after a tip-off to avoid getting arrested by pursuing customs officials. Hence, his only record of his visit was this postcard. And I often wondered who these warships were when they were there at the time. Father clearly reloaded his camera as he took this photo at their stop in Vienna. And they recorded their concern at the overtly military bearing of their flying club hosts, which they found when they were staying overnight in Germany. The arrival of the Pussmoth and Gypsy Moth at Heston after their 6-hour, 40-minute flight from Germany on May the 15th meant their late arrival gave rather rise to a lukewarm reception because of the delays that they had. Father then flew Clydesdale's Gypsy Moth back to Ayr and to Renfrew. He stopped at Ayr. This is him at the old racecourse in Ayr. He's said to have given his mother a flight round the town in the Gypsy Moth while he was there. After the flight, the Everest team were warmly feted for their achievements and were subjected to much publicity, which my father didn't enjoy at all. It included this luncheon given by the Times, where the members of the team were presented with commemorative medals by the Duke of York, who was later to become King George VI. Their friends at the Flying Club, the Scottish Flying Club, invited them as special guests for the 1933 Renfrew pageant. And here they took part in the 602 Squadron aerobatic display for the guests and public before peeling off to a special enclosure to join their guests for their presentation. Father's gift was a silver cigarette box that we still have at home today. There was a chance that the Everest memorabilia in Father's collection might have been shown in the Antiques Roadshow in 2008, but the BBC producers found more interesting stuff to present to the viewers on that occasion. I don't think they'll ever run it again. The Everest flight team, soon after their return, set out to attempt a record-breaking round-the-world flight. They planned to do this in 6 days with 7,000-mile legs. While Father was heavily involved in the planning of the long-distance flight, he was also briefly entered for the London to Melbourne air race in one of these de Havilland Comet races. However, his entry was withdrawn, probably because of lack of funds, and the long-distance project was also abandoned for similar reasons. Importantly, though, the results of the Melbourne race, where this latest all-metal airliner nearly beat the Comet racer, it was only half an hour between them, made it clear to Father and Clydesdale that aviation was going to be the future for commercial and military transport. And the major legacy of the Everest experience, apart from the technical and political spin-off, was to cement the friendship of these two airmen, and it gave them a popularity and influence that allowed them to achieve their ambition to ensure that Scotland could play a major part in the future industry. I don't know what's your timing, Graham. I could do a bit more if you want.
That's we're what, an hour and 15 at the moment. I'm sure there's lots of questions.
I can call it a day at that if you want.
Up to you. You could give a little bit of a preamble, and then that gives everyone an idea of a future one on Scottish aviation.
There are only a few more slides here if you want.
Yeah, go for it. I'm sure everyone's enjoying it.
Right, after the Everest flight, Father and Clydesdale continued in their 602 squadron duties, where the squadron was now equipped with these Hawker Hart day bombers. Father would find excuses to fly up and down to London to visit his fiancée. And on one of these return trips, he was caught in bad weather during a snowstorm in the Yorkshire Valley, and recorded he had to fly by following telegraph poles when his windscreen was shattered by a collision with a crow. He confesses that this was a near disaster, but he managed to avoid hitting anything else, and he got back to Glasgow, which by then was in bright sunshine. And he complained bitterly about the duff weather reports from the Air Ministry at the time, because if he'd known it, he could have flown over the top instead of through the middle of it. By 1935, the government decided that more pilots were needed for the RAF, and they promoted a private enterprise scheme to start up new schools. Father and Clydesdale leapt on the opportunity to start one up at Prestwick. Clydesdale's family trust purchased the land, the de Havilland Aircraft Company provided the aircraft, and my father's newly acquired father-in-law chipped in a substantial amount on his behalf. Known to the 602 squadron pilots as the Prestwick Gap, a bolt hole in the clouds, invaluable when Renfrew became clagged in, was their choice of airport. During World War II, Prestwick Airport, under the ministry control, but with Scottish Aviation as operational managers, developed into a major aviation centre for the transatlantic passenger and military transport. Immediately after the war, Scottish Aviation opened up a passenger airline service based at Prestwick, converting Dakota and Liberator aircraft for passenger use, which ran until 1960. And Scottish Aviation was successful in winning a ministry tender for a 4-seat short takeoff and landing aircraft for the RAF. This started their manufacturing business in 1946. It first flew in 1947. This painting of the Mark I Pioneer was by Tom Gilfillan, who painted the famous murals around the Orangefield passenger terminal. But the Gypsy engine was replaced with the Leonides to give it better power. And here it is in the RAF livery, demonstrating its outstanding takeoff capabilities. And this is the handing over ceremony at Prestwick, where the company and the aviation guests were showing the first aircraft of 50 or so that went to the RAF. A total of 57 Prestwick Pioneers were sold, nearly all military versions, mainly to the RAF, and also to the air forces of Malaya and Ceylon. Here, a difficult approach is typical of the landing strips cut out in the jungle in Malaya for the Prestwick Pioneers. The ability of the short takeoff and landing Pioneer was a way my father saw to bring the civilizing effects of air transport to the remote and inaccessible parts of the world. But it needed a passenger carrying aircraft with a larger capacity. And to this end, Scottish Aviation developed a 16-passenger airliner called the Twin Pioneer for this role. After several years of development and testing, the Twin Pioneer was ready to be shown off to potential customers. Several sales trips were conducted around the world to demonstrate the aircraft. And these are a few examples. Here at Farnborough, out in Malaya, the jungle of French Guiana, and coming into land on a Brazilian airstrip out in the sticks. Scottish Aviation also planned to use the Twin for intercity transport and showcased the idea at the Paris Air Show in 1957. where they operated regular flights for visitors from the central Paris heliport at Issy to the air show at Le Bourget. The plan was to run a Paris to London service, landing at Wormwood Scrubs at a cost of time and time of 1/3 less than the current BEA Viscount operation. In 1955, I chose to design and build a model of the Twin Pioneer, 5-foot wingspan, twin diesel engines, and a single channel radio, which I showed you earlier. After 2 summers of building over the school holidays, Father and I took it out to the 12th fairway of Portland Golf Course for its first flight. The model took off well and climbed to about 30 feet. Then one of the outer wing panel struts detached, and this result was a pile of balsa wood wreckage on the fairway. It lasted all of 30 seconds in the air and was a painful lesson. In addition, it was to be a rather eerie portent of an event a year later. Father joined a sales mission to North Africa being conducted in this Twin Pioneer when a wing strut failure, not dissimilar to the one that caused the wreck of my scale model, brought about a crash in the Libyan desert in December 1957. All 6 occupants, including my father and his test pilot Roy Smith, were killed. And this accident rather dampened the airline's interest in the aircraft. However, the aviation engineering industry at Prestwick, founded by my father and Clydesdale, has resulted today in the creation of many jobs, and while perhaps nowhere near the scale he had initially dreamed of, it manifests the legacy of the Everest flight and the employment which this Prestwick pioneer had hoped to create when he started it over 85 years ago. The end. There we are.
Wow. Thank you very much, Dougal. That was a credible story. Amazing sort of like pictures and everything. You've put an awful lot of effort into that, and it's quite hard to sort of comprehend. Like, it would be an almighty achievement flying across Everest now and sort of charting that route. So to do that in 1933, yeah, unbelievable.
In a biplane.
In a biplane.
Yeah, in a biplane.
Open cockpit.
Never been done
Anything,
before. Everything was new. Everything was different. Everything was
without the maps, without the radio. So open to questions.
Do I need to do anything here? No.
No, you're all good.
Okay.
Just
Good.
any of our free flight guys fancy building a Westland Wallace now? Oh, in fact, well, Mike Smith, do you want to mute yourself? You might have a comment about the Twin Pioneer part.
Oh, yeah,
There
Twin
we go,
Pioneer,
Mike.
loved the aeroplane, but it was a real pig to trim.
What size was your model? It was twin
what,
electric.
About 40 inches, mostly made of foam, blue foam, horrible stuff. But it was just a tad heavy, and the rudder and the fins were far too big. I couldn't get any adjustment for free flight. Just the slightest deviation, it just used to turn in on itself. And yes, it did. It lasted 1 nationals, and that was that. I've still got the rudders stuck on the wall in my workshop, just as a souvenir. I wonder the problem with the struts. I have read about that, and I had a similar sort of problem, even trying to attach them. So yes, it follows.
It was a fatigue failure in the joint that caused the problem.
Right.
And in fact, the irony of it was they had recognized the problem, and they had converted all of the aircraft, all of the 5 demo aircraft, except one, the last one, and it was due to be done on its return from Libya when it failed. They couldn't figure out what the lifespan of the fatigue was.
Right. Thank you very much. It's amazing.
just a question, Dougal. What was it that sort of like fired up your dad's interest in aviation then? Because your grandfather, it was more
They were shipbuilders.
yeah.
Yes. I think basically the shipbuilding trade was dying at the time he was coming out of his sort of training period. He did a year as a mud student in a sheep farm, but he had, I think, looked at the fact that there was aircraft flying about in air during First World War at Turnberry and at Ayr, so he will have seen aircraft flying about. Also, while he was in when his father was running the shipyard at Irvine, the first of the manoeuvres of the BE-2s were taking place in the fields at Gales. So he will have seen aircraft flying about, and I think that was a far more exciting thing for a young boy to be experiencing, and it was obviously a future rather than a past, which is what the shipbuilding was. So I think that was what put him in that direction.
Dougal, my father trained at Prestwick in 1937 when he came across from Canada on a short service commission.
Really?
So it's quite fascinating to hear how it all happened.
Yeah. Well, 1937, yes. That's what that was the year I was born. So I didn't know very much about it then, but I've got all the history now.
Yeah. Yes, there's a photograph of him, I think, with an MGJ2, and it's got on the back of it Prestwick. And there's another photograph of clearly where he was lodging or whatever they did then in those days.
Yeah, they did have a lot of people lodged out.
No.
In the local town.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a busy time then.
David Oakley, do you want to ask your question? There we go.
Yeah, hello. That was fantastic, Dougal. Really enjoyed that and inspiring, and it's inspired me to build a Wallace aircraft. It really has. But why was the Wallace aircraft chosen for the flight? I may have missed it in your talk. If you said it, pardon. Excuse me.
I don't think from reading the books on the subject, it was big enough. It had the capability of carrying the Pegasus engine, and that was the engine that had been in the aircraft that had taken the height record to 40,000 feet just a year or so before. So they needed an aircraft that was capable of managing the size of the engine, and the Westland Wallace, the Houston Westland, which they called the PV3, was there ready and available and could easily be adapted to take the other engine. And they wanted another aircraft that was of the same size, shape, the same stable, in other words, because they didn't want lots of different, they didn't want two different types. So they converted the first of the Wallace development aircraft from the Wapiti 5 and turned that into what they called the Westland Wallace. So it was really the prototype Wallace, and they needed two aircraft that were the same.
Okay.
So I think that was the reason. I haven't actually seen anything written that tells you what the options were.
Right, and then
okay, thanks.
Brian Lee is sort of saying, well, there's a Wallace fuselage at Old Warden.
But there's also one at Hendon.
Yeah, which is the one that I saw. I must admit, I didn't, when I did my internship in London in 1998 and visited Hendon and saw the Wallace, I must admit I knew nothing of this story. So it's interesting now to piece all the bits and pieces together.
I believe Hendon, we were down at Hendon a few years ago, and they said they actually had bits of the wings as well.
Right.
In a shed somewhere. There was a debate about whether we could bring it up to Prestwick and rebuild it.
Oh, that would be interesting.
Well, they were willing to let us have it, which I was
Wow.
quite surprised at. But we haven't quite got that museum idea off the ground here at Prestwick yet.
No.
You could use the fuselage from Old Warden. It's a good start.
Yes, I didn't know they had one at Old Warden as well. Or have they moved it perhaps from Hendon recently?
I honestly
I don't
know.
No.
There's various comments coming in as well. Just thanking you, saying it was superb, from Augustine in Spain. From Norway. There we go. Paul, I'm not sure the surname, but Paul is saying that he thinks the Wallace fuselage at Old Warden is a replica.
Oh, might be, yes.
Which was built by Hawker Restorations to recreate the Everest flight.
There was a chap called George Armand who tried to build a Wallace as well at one time. But he never got enough money.
Graham, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it, Caroline.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely inspirational, really wonderful. I just wanted to know, you said that your father thought on his second flight that he flew over the top of Everest, but you've later worked out that he didn't actually make it. Was he of the belief that he had, throughout his life, that he had flown over on the second flight, or did you find that out later?
I don't know. The interesting thing for me is that as a youngster, my father never spoke about the Everest flight to me. I never talked about it to him. I know nothing about that. But I think when you look at the back of the photographs of the survey pictures that I've got, he writes Everest on it.
Okay.
So he at the time, he was editing those photographs for the book, because he and Clydesdale wrote their own version of the Everest book, called The Pilot's Book of Everest, in a couple of years after the initial book was written in 33. So they wrote a book in 35. And he, in all his narrative and everything he's shown, was that he was convinced that it was Everest he was over.
Right.
But when you look at the survey photos, it's clearly it wasn't. And I tried to show in that simulation how it could have made that mistake, because at 34,000 feet, when you're flying over Lhotse, you look as though you're over the top of Everest.
Yes. Perspective is everything.
I know, and I don't know anything afterwards. I mean, I wondered about how long afterwards the actual map was printed. That map I showed you there has never actually featured in any book or anything. We happen to have a copy here in his records, but it may have been years afterwards. I don't know.
It gives a special perspective for me, because I've been fortunate enough to fly over the Swiss and the Austrian Alps several times with my husband, and he flies business jets. So there are times when he flies quite low and things, and it's the most breathtaking view you can imagine. It's just incredible.
Yes, what you've got to remember too is that nobody ever seen them before. I mean,
that's right.
Above Everest, so they didn't really know exactly where they were. I don't think. And they could see when you were level to them that was the biggest one and the highest one. So that's where we're going for.
Yeah.
In reality, when you actually get in amongst them.
Yes, it is. It's quite different.
They all look much the same. And when you're in a cockpit at 34,000 feet looking over the side, you've never been there before and you've got no map. It's quite understandable for me anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
And what I haven't been able to explain either is the great bump that he describes. He talks about as though there was an explosive factory underneath. So there must have been a huge upcurrent at the side of Lhotse that he just got onto.
Yeah.
And that kicked him up, and he thought, well, maybe that must be it. But the air currents up there were quite diabolical, I reckon. When you think about on the previous flight in Lhotse, they went to kick 2,000 feet down below. On the second flight, almost the same place, he was kicked in the butt by an explosion.
Absolutely amazing.
It is quite incredible what that flight was
Yeah.
as an
without pressurized cabins or anything.
no. Hanging
Yeah,
on.
absolutely amazing. Yeah.
And when you look through the floor,
Thank you.
you've got just a little metal skin around you and a few
Yeah.
strings.
Exactly.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm amazed,
Fabulous.
and
Thank
I'm very
you.
sad they didn't ever talk to me about it.
I can well imagine it's a lot of
He was always
personal experience lost.
He was always looking ahead for the next thing. He wasn't, never looked behind him.
Yeah, fantastic.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. It was a privilege. Thank you.
Chris Allen.
Graham, can I just make a comment?
Oh yeah, off you go, Robin.
Thank you. I'm going to have to leave you in a moment, so I've got another Zoom meeting with my daughter in Brazil. I'm probably late for that now anyway, but still, I just realized how interesting it was, and thank Dougal for what he's done and what he gave us. I just like to say that I was born 7 days before the first flight. Unfortunately, I don't remember too much about it. I'll say good night to everybody now, if I may, and see you again next time.
Okay. Thanks for joining, Robin. Good night. Yeah, Chris.
Yes. Thanks, Dougal, for that. I mean, that's not something that too many people get to see. But you mentioned earlier on about special fuel for the Wallaces.
Yeah.
Have you got any more details? What did why did you need special fuel?
Well, they had a high octane rating, and they had a high lead content in the fuel in order to get the necessary, I think, compression ratio, and for the supercharging.
So
I could open up the book and read it out for you.
So it was purely to keep the horsepower at altitude, was it?
Yeah, I would imagine so. Yes, they had a special chap with them all the time who mixed the fuel for every flight.
All right.
What was in the drums wasn't what they put into the airplane immediately. They doctored it every time they used it.
All right. That's interesting.
In order to get the horsepower, yes.
So they were. Sounds to me like they were still experimenting with leaded fuel.
They were, yes. They had what they called a high lead content fuel, is what they describe.
There's a good book on that by Rob Banks.
Yes.
He goes into that, and that was the period when they were doing all the doping of fuels for Schneider Trophy, and I think this is a continuation of all that work that was going on.
Yeah, I think.
And that would be, you'd let it to keep your detonation limits, because you push your boost up, therefore detonation becomes an issue. So, and that all, of course, led into our ability to get horsepower out of the Merlin, didn't it?
Well, ultimately, yes. It's clear they used the opportunity to do some experimenting at altitude, which they wouldn't be able to do anywhere else.
Yeah, they also had to do some experiments with their magnetos too.
Yes. Yeah, dielectric strength goes down with altitude, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Dougal.
Glad you enjoyed it.
I had muted myself there. Anyone else got any questions? Andy, do you have anything to comment after all your extensive flying and biplanes?
No, nothing significant. I find it quite interesting that Dougal thinks that his father misidentified what he overflew. I think it's pilots, if he was an exceptional pilot, which he probably was, he'd have known about parallax. So what I think, from what I've seen and what you've said, I think he probably misidentified the other peak as Everest, rather than having seen Everest in the distance and thought he'd flown over it, because you know what you fly over when you're flying that type of aeroplane. Just intuitively, it's a bit like spending all your life driving a car,
yeah, okay.
and then parking it in a supermarket car park inside the lines. You do it without thinking. Well, most people do. Some people just don't bother. You intuitively know what you're flying over. So I think it's possibly more due to a misident of the mountain rather than thinking he was somewhere where he wasn't. But that was a great talk. Fascinating. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Can I just add something, please?
Yeah, of course, Gordon.
I would just like to say that I'm very much in awe of those chaps who flew over Everest when there were all the crosswinds and downdrafts and they didn't know what they were hitting. They had no cloud and clump radar or anything like that. I think it was a fantastic effort and absolutely brilliant. And thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
It really was fantastic.
There we go. Danny's expressing his thanks as well. Danny, do you want to say it rather than me reading it out?
Yeah, no, it was fascinating to hear and see. You know, thank you so much for sharing it. It's you know, it's just not something you get to see normally, is it, or hear? So very brave chaps.
Well, it's taken me quite a long time to get enough knowledge of it in order to do a talk like that. I've been at it for several years now. I gradually add a little bit more every time I do it. Yeah. Find out a little bit more, figure it out a little bit more detail. Yeah, I thought the Google Earth simulations were quite a good way of demonstrating it.
Yes, I thought so. Yeah, it was good.
That was
very
excellent, Dougal. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
How long ago did you realise that your father didn't actually fly over Everest then, Dougal? And was it recently, or are we talking like 10 years ago or longer?
It would be about 10 years ago. I was asked to do a talk about 20 years ago, the very first time I started it. At that point, I virtually knew nothing except I had the book. And then we had a large suitcase full of memorabilia that my mother had squirreled away when she was looking after things. And I eventually dug out all the photographs and scanned them in, and then had to try and identify which photographs was which, and had to try and learn about the topography and all the other detail. And initially all I had to read was what was in the books that were written at the time. But when you actually looked at the survey map that I showed you there, you could see that there was no survey film on the second flight which showed Everest. And it was only when I started to look at that in detail that I realized you couldn't have been over Everest unless the cameras had been switched off. You'd flown over it and come back again and switch the cameras back on again, which you couldn't do as a pilot. So I reckon that has to be the way it was. It's I can't explain it any other way.
Okay, any final questions for Dougal before we sign off for the evening? I'm looking around, seeing if there's any hands up or any comments. No, I think that's it. So thanks once again, Dougal. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it too. I know.
It was a privilege to be able to speak to you all. It was a very austere audience that I was talking to. I do appreciate it.